Hi, welcome to this video on the true flat-felled seam. So this is not the half flat-felled seam, which is usually called the flat-felled seam. This is the actual flat-felled seam. So as with my other videos in this series on how to sew for beginners, anything that I actually use in the video, I will find a link for it online, and I'll put the link in this video somehow below. So this is the true flat-felled seam. I have never actually seen this seam on anything that I haven't made myself, because it's not common, but it's insanely strong, right? Insanely strong, almost certainly stronger than you'll ever need. But it could be useful if you have to do, like if there's something wrong with your stitch for some reason, like you need a really long stitch length, or could be good if you're hand sewing and you aren't sure how good your stitch is, then this would be very good for that as well. So it takes the preparation beforehand is unusual, and it's like quite complicated, but the payoff is worth it. The sewing itself is very easy. It saves a lot of time because you don't need to cut the seam allowance. Unlike the two that we've just done, the French seam and the half flat-felled seam, we had to sew something and then we had to cut some stuff and then we had to carry on sewing, whereas with this you don't have to do that. So it saves time on those seams. It's complicated on curves, but it can be done. But mainly it's a super strong seam, and if you can get your head around the complicated bit before we sew, then it's actually a very easy and fast seam to do. So let's get on with it. So for this seam, I've actually never seen it explained in the way that I'm about to explain it. So, I mean, this method probably is in some really old-fashioned book somewhere, but I had to figure this out myself. But it means that you now know a method that I've figured out, which is good. So the preparation beforehand is you need to decide on a top and a bottom fabric. And this is essential this time. In the French seam it was of no real importance, but on this one it's actually vitally important because you need to give your bottom panel double the seam allowance. So this double seam allowance is only on the seams which will actually be using this stitch. So if you were doing, let's say, a jacket, the side seam could have this stitch, but then the sleeve seam might not. So if you weren't doing it on the sleeve and you were only doing it on the side seam, then you would only give the double seam allowance to the side seam, and you would only do that on the bottom panel. So you need to identify before you cut which panel is going to be the bottom panel. So as I said before, normally the back panel is the bottom panel. So the back panel on whatever you're making, that's the bottom panel, but it's up to you, whichever you want to make the bottom panel. You just have to definitely decide on what your bottom panel is before you measure and cut. So that's the key, is you give the bottom panel double the seam allowance. So what we are now going to do is we're going to fold one seam allowance away from the edge on both panels. So the direction that we fold in is actually different. So on the bottom panel we want to fold good side to good side. I'm going to randomly make this my bottom panel. Okay, so with this I would fold this good side to good side. Okay, so it looks like that. And then on the top panel I would do fold bad side to bad side. So I'm going to make these folds now that are exactly one seam allowance apart, and then I'm going to press. So So don't do it in the way that I'm actually doing it, because you would want it to be as accurate as possible. Okay, so this is just for a demonstration that I'm only doing it by eye. So you would actually want to press it with more accuracy than what I'm doing. So this is my bottom panel. So I'm pressing it good side to good side, and I'm making a nice sharp fold when I do that press. So for my top panel, I will press it bad side to bad side, and then do the same thing. So because I haven't been accurate, you're going to see the results of that in my finished seam. So you will want to be accurate if this is important. It might not be important, so you might not need to be accurate either. But if it is important, be accurate on this seam allowance. So the top panel is folded bad side to bad side, and the bottom panel, which has a double seam allowance, is folded with one seam allowance, the same size as this, but is folded good side to good side. So now that we have folded both of these, we have a top panel and we have a bottom panel. So the bottom panel, which is this one, is cut to a double seam allowance. So this seam allowance here is actually right there, whereas on this panel the seam allowance is not there, the seam allowance goes to there. Okay, and the reason why we do this is because we are now going to slot these into each other like that, and once they're slotted in properly, which might take you some finesse, depends on your fabric, depends on the quality of your fold, and it depends on how accurate you were with the where exactly that fold was. So once you have got it to lie in with itself, which if you pressed it into a sharp fold it should do fairly easily. Once you've got it and you're happy with it, then that's basically all the hard bit is done. In fact, not basically, that is all the hard bit is done. So all we have to do now, after we've slot the two into each other, you can also pin, right? I would recommend that you pin. Ensure the folds are in tight together, and now all we have to do is just sew either one of these or both of them. Okay, so if we just sew one, that's great for hand sewers because you've got a very strong seam, but you've only made one stitch. Okay, rather than two, or rather than having to do anything with the other raw edges, you've done one stitch and it's hidden all the raw edges and given you a strong seam. And if you are sewing on a machine, you might want to do both of the stitches. So you want to stitch close to here, and then you want to do a second stitch that's close to that edge. And each one of those, of course, it's going through 1, 2, 3, 4 layers of fabric. So as it's going through all of that, it's very strong. It's pinning all that together in one spot. And if you then sew it twice, it's immensely strong compared to any of the other seams that we have looked at. So this is incredibly strong, and literally once you've done this hard bit, all you have to do is sew it, and you can just do one single stitch if you want to. So I'm going to sew it now so you can actually see what it looks like, but this basically is it, and it needs no pressing afterwards. The only pressing that you need to do is the pressing beforehand to get those folds good. This is what our finished seam looks like. I haven't even pressed this. This is just what it looks like already. And this is the bad sides. Everything is completely encased within. And all I needed to do was that prep beforehand, and it made this a super easy stitch to do. I did use pins, but you don't need to use many pins. I just put one in the top, one in the middle, and one in the bottom of this panel. So you probably want to do them perhaps 9 inches apart, just to ensure that the two folds do stay tight in together rather than start moving about. And then you have your seam, but this is immensely strong, so the fabric of this would rip, I think, long before this seam would for almost any fabric. It's very, very strong, and it didn't require any sewing and then cutting and then sewing again. So it's actually very simple and very underutilized, and I would recommend more people to actually do this. So all you need to remember is you cut the bottom panel of a double seam allowance, and the reason for that is where this point is actually taken 2 times seam allowance for this bottom panel, whereas it's only taken 1 seam allowance for this top panel. So where the fabrics actually meet, right, you need 2 seam allowances for this bottom panel extra on top of that. So always cut 2 seam allowances on the bottom panel, and then press accurately 1 seam allowance, good side to good side, bad side to bad side, so that you can lock them in together. And that's it. That is the entire seam. So in the next video, which will be the final one, we'll be looking at the last seam. Again, it encapsulates all the raw edges. This one is good for hand sewers especially, but you basically use it. It's a different way of doing something that's very similar to the French seam, and it's called the faux French seam or the mock French seam. So that's what we'll be doing in our next video.